Hi, everyone. Thank you for checking in at the Inner Game of Change podcast, where we focus on exploring the multi-layers of managing organizational change. My guests cover a diverse number of critical topics to enable effective and sustainable change adoption, including communication, leadership, training, change impact, process design, change capability, and much more. My name is Ali Jamal, and you're listening to the Inner Game of Change podcast. In this podcast, I'm joined by the global developmental psychologist and system change leader, Joan Lurie, to chat about how we can use her proprietary Orgonomics methodology to drive complex change. I'm grateful to have Joan chatting to me today. So, Joan, thank you so much for joining the Inner Game of Change podcast. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for inviting me, Ali.
Thank you so much. Today, I would like to cover the exciting term Orgonomics. I've read a lot about it, and I've read about your work over the last 2 or 3 decades, and I can't find a more passionate person about Orgonomics. So you want to share with our listeners what Orgonomics is, but first, how you landed in the in the world of system design.
Yeah, that would be great. So maybe a little bit about my story first. I came to the work in 1993, actually, the beginnings of the work. I was in an internal OD role in a company where we were preparing the company for post-apartheid South Africa. We were in the midst of the transition, sort of edging towards the first democratic election. We'd begun the work in the late 80s, early 90s. And as part of that transformation work, the CEO of the company also realized that he had to change the operating model of the organization. At the time, we were 4 businesses, one an independent wood chipboard distribution business, retail and wholesale, and 2 manufacturing businesses, a holding company, together listed as a group entity. But there was a view that if we stayed as separate businesses with their own brands and their own processes, etc., that we were going to become less and less profitable. So the CEO knew that he needed to shift the business and integrate the company. He had a strategy for that. He knew what the new operating model looked like, which was to have a distribution arm of the business, a manufacturing arm, and a sales force, and basically no longer have 3 independent businesses with 3 brands. But he also knew the history and the research around M&A work, whether it was internal M&A work or not, was that a lot of that work actually didn't give the return on investment. And he was very worried about that integration. So he brought out Irving Borwick, who was a systemic change consultant who'd been experimenting with the application of systems thinking to organizational change. And he came out to work with us to help us integrate the system, so to speak. And that's where I got the glasses. I got a new understanding of how you can understand and make sense of organizations, what they are, how behavior in them functions, and how to change them. And instead of looking at organizations as a combination of people come together in interpersonal relationships, or as a machine, as a set of processes and structures, you could look at a system as a set of integrated role relations, and rules of engagement between the parts or the entities of the system. And that pair of glasses, learning to see organizations that way, is really what Orgonomics is based on.
So there's one thing that, from my understanding, is that Orgonomics can help leaders see things clearer, but once they see them, they can't unsee them.
Yeah. So I think that it's based on this idea that actually what our experience is and what assumptions we run determine what we see. and help us, our assumptions help us frame the reality. So there is stuff in front of us which is there, but we can't necessarily see it because our own meaning-making systems, our way of making sense, is looking for something else.
Yes. Yeah.
And so our way of seeing the world is determined in some ways by ourselves and how we make sense. And then in that way, we also co-create the world around us. And so we become, what the kind of technical idea or term would be self-referential.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if we actually were able to think that there is a different way to see what's in front of us, that there is a new pair of glasses, and that we are able to offer leaders the opportunity to try those glasses on and to begin to see the world through that frame, then they will learn to see things that are actually right in front of them, but they're not seeing because they're not looking for it.
Yeah. So the things that we look for, this is similar to, it's like a type of confirmation bias. So I look for the things that validates my biases. And what you're trying to do is that you try to suspend that because there are other things that some people describe them as blind spots, which can be critical in helping you find the right solution. And so you describe it as a new way of doing change. And most of us talk about change as we make change. So what's the differentiation between the two?
It's a great question. I think if we look at the traditional change management industry as a field or as a system, there are a whole lot of embedded assumptions in the field about how to do change and how to get behavior change in organizations or how to change organizations. And I would say that most of the assumptions in the field of change management are based on kind of technical or mechanistic assumptions that you can change a process and then change the organization, or they're based on humanistic assumptions or psychological or interpersonal assumptions, which is about, changing something which is core to people, their values, their personalities, their styles. And sometimes the person and the technical meet because, we think we can fix things through capability build or skill building, etc. There's a third set of assumptions which we can hold about change management and organizations is that if you want to bring about change, you don't necessarily have to change something technical like a process or the org structure, which we see leaders and change management specialists doing all the time, the org design or process design. Neither do you have to necessarily change the people, who they are. But what you want to bring about change in is the set of relations between the parts and how different parts of the organization or the system see their roles. And if you bring more systemic assumptions that the change will happen more in the in-between, in the interaction between the parts rather than just in the parts alone, or in the people, then you start to see things that you didn't see before because you start to look for how are people seeing their roles? How are subsystems or entities in the organization seeing their roles? So in other words, how does marketing as a subsystem of an organization see its role? And how does marketing see its role in relation to sales or in relation to category management?
Yeah.
And typically we are not looking to answer those questions because we're not starting with the assumptions that that's important. And so when you start to try and discover what's going on in an organization through this lens, you start to ask very different questions, which reveal different things, which will then say, actually, we need to change how people see their roles or how entities see their roles. We have to change the dynamic of the role relations between entities and reset the rules of engagement for how they interact. And actually, if we're able to change that, we can bring about change much more rapidly with more speed, less turbulence, less noise, or less resistance, then, typically trying to roll a change management program into an organization in a linear way, starting with the solution and then, trying to engage people and get their buy-in into the solution.
And then you mentioned, Joan, so there's a system and there's an individual and there's the role in there. And the role does not necessarily mean the job you do. The role is the value of why you exist in the first place. Is that what it is?
Yeah, it's the function that you fulfill.
Yes.
On behalf of the system. The organization system has contracted you and brought you in to take up a role on the behalf of the whole.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So I'm not there because they need Joan. I'm there because they've contracted Joan to fulfill a role or a function on behalf of the whole.
Yeah.
Well, I'm there in both capacities.
And that function is the purpose, the ultimate purpose of what you do. So the doing is not really the job. Is the goal is the job. The purpose is the job. And so you talk about three different things. So these rewiring, these reframing, and these repatterning. And so these are the three sort of strategies that underpin Orgonomics. Do you wanna talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So maybe I'll just take a step back in order to explain those things and talk about the role, the system, and the individual.
Please do.
Because that's a core underpinning framework for the Orgonomics work. And I think often, Ali, what gets confused is that sometimes when I talk about role, people think I'm talking about the job.
Yes.
And I think it is important, as you're pointing out, to get the distinction that there is the job role that you're there to fulfill. And when I ask people, what is your role? They say, I have to, they give me the list of tasks that they have to fulfill.
You're right.
But really what I want to understand is, what is the function or the purpose? Why does your role exist? Why does it exist versus what is it that you actually do in order to fulfill that purpose or that role? And sometimes we fulfill an organizational role, and sometimes we fulfill a systemic role on behalf of the system. So let me explain the difference and why it's important to understand that difference. I've just been, say, working with a client, and they have a presenting problem where they have some noise between one part of their business and another part. And they're trying to understand what's going on. And the role, one of the key people that is involved in that is in the role of CFO. He's the Chief Financial Officer of the business. And there are quite a few people in the organization that are saying, he's a problem. He's power hungry. He's got a big ego. He wants to control everything. So you can hear the meaning making is that the problem sits with him, the person, and that actually he needs to change and he needs to let go of his ego. And so you can see the attribution of the problem and what the solution might be. It sits with the individual.
So the focus is on the behavior. That's what they're talking about.
Yes, and on the person.
Yes, yep.
Then we step back and we start to kind of ask people, well, what's your understanding of how he would or she would be taking up that role if it were different? What's your sense making of it? And what we begin to discover is that the way that he's taking up the role in the business, particularly amplified in a COVID context, because when you look at a system, context is very important.
Yes.
The role that he is playing is the protector. And so when there are cash flow issues and things that come in, he sees it as his role to lower costs, to protect the business, to make sure that the business is safe. But he doesn't check with the rest of the executive team or even with the CEO that there's an expectation that he plays that systemic role on his own. But in his mind, he, with good intention, not with bad intention, has stepped into the role of protector of the system. Okay. So it's not necessarily that he's a power-hungry, egotistical human who's got bad intent and holding on to control. it's because actually maybe with good intent, he's stepping into the role of protector, but he hasn't actually contracted with others in the system to be playing that systemic role in that way.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So he was acting in sort of in a silo mode, and the consequence of that, acting in that way with the best of intention, it creates that noise and tension that people judge this particular person on the behavior and the output of that behavior.
Right.
And so what you're proposing is that that particular person would need to step back and then understand that they are a piece within a bigger system. And so whatever decision they make, it's got consequences on the other systems.
Yeah, and also has implications for others' roles and the role relations between his role as the CFO and the protector and the CEO's role and other executives around the team. Right? So it's important for him, when we talk about the reframing piece of Orgonomics, the work we have to do is not change him to make him less egotistical and less power hungry. I mean, we'll be there for if that were the problem.
Yes.
What we can help him with is to reframe how he sees his role in the system at this point in time, in this context. Okay. And therefore shift the pattern of relations between him, his role, and the CEO's role and the rest of the executive team.
Right.
And reframing the roles and getting the system pattern to work differently in how their roles relate and connect. That is the work, the systemic work of Orgonomics. And so you want to discover how people are perceiving the roles and how the roles are working, either individual roles or subsystem roles between entities, because it could be, let's say, between the exec team and the board. And once you can kind of discover that, put on the glasses to see the relational interactions that are happening and how people's sense making is around the role, then you can do the reframing and the repatterning. That is not easy work to do, but it's much easier work to do than trying to change the person and make the person bad or wrong.
Yes. And we come across a lot of that from my experience, there's always going to be one individual or two, especially at a leadership level, where we think of them as blockers, mainly because of the way they go about their business. And they perform their duties and their roles based on their understanding, as you mentioned, with the best of intention. And so it can be something that we need to think about when we talk about rolling out new changes, especially at larger scale, is to, at the design stage or even before that, we start thinking about, do we have the right setup for this change to have the minimum level of resistance, i.e. minimum level of gravity, so we can, so people can adopt it, and then usually the stakeholders or the customers will get the benefit out of that. Have I got that close to right?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're raising is one of the most critical issues for why change management and transformations actually fail, in my mind, from my hypothesis, because we don't set up the transformation system for success. We actually set it up for gravitational pull for resistance. And I see often what happens in transformation programs is that you set up a transformation team who have the role in the system to drive, and I say that with strength and in inverted commas, because you can't drive transformation, but I hear that language all the time. It's their role to drive the transformation. And what that does is it sets up a team that is separate from the kind of organizational system, leadership system, who really should have the role and the accountability to transform the system. And so you set up a resistance between the transformation team, who get the role to drive the change, and the executive team often, who actually see it as their role to lead and transform their business. And you set up a a pattern of relating between the transformation team and an executive team, which actually becomes problematic, and that in itself gets in the way of the change. So if you could design your change and transformation system with the right role setups, and that if you are going to have a transformation team, which often I say is actually not necessary and I recommend against it, I'm going against the grain of the change management industry because it's so wired in that you have a transformation program office, a transformation team, right? But actually those implicit assumptions that have very seldom been questioned are often the assumptions that are potentially faulty and get in our way.
And then they create a lot of friction and frustration, and the leaders usually, or some of them, think that outsourcing the transformation drive is actually not their responsibility.
Right, not my role. Oh, you've given that role to the transformation team.
Yes, you're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can see how that pattern, that role relational dynamic actually becomes the problem. And do we design for that intentionally? No. But actually without having the systemic glasses and understanding complex relational patterning, we set that up naively. Right.
Yeah.
And another role that is typical in the change management industry, which I'm going to deliberately be provocative around, is change champions.
Yes.
If you start to bring a systemic lens, what you'll think about is actually by calling out and making change champions and giving them the role, you actually absolve that role of other people in the system.
Yeah. Okay. So this is an interesting point because I do work with change champions, and I'm fully aware of what you're talking about. So what you're saying is that, so here's a scenario. There's a change. We set up a transformation team. They drive the change. We've got a good level of sponsorship and support from the leaders. And we've got a time frame to deliver that transformation program. We've got a network of change champions, and then they help with the implementation and training, whatever their remit is. And so there's always a danger of having the change champions that we outsource the responsibility from the leaders to the transformation team, to the change champions.
Yeah.
Especially when we ask the change champions to do it as a discretionary effort rather than their own responsibility. Right. Yeah, and then we get into the trouble of, well, the transformation team has been dismantled. Now it's actually the responsibility of the change champions.
Right. Or at some point you hand it back to the leadership team or people in the business, and they go, "Not my change."
Yeah, right. It's not my baby. Yes.
Not my baby. Right. Don't hand that back to me in that way.
Yeah.
So yes, absolutely what you're saying, Ali. I see that repeated over and over again. And I think that, often when change doesn't happen the way we'd like it to, the attribution or the meaning making is, people didn't like it. People don't like change. People are resistant. But actually, you haven't seen how you as executives and as change management agents are co-creating the resistance by how you're actually setting up the change in the first place.
Yes. Yep. So talk to me, Joan, and this is really great. I am aware always when I talk about champion network is that the responsibility still sits with the leaders. Unless, of course, and I've done it a couple of times where we put a business case to create the capacity for the champions to actually have a responsibility. So it's either through a secondment and whatever you want to call it. And then we create another level of responsibility, but within those business units that can help. Obviously, that's got consequences to it because there's a cost every time you take somebody out of their role and give them an extra responsibility, even if it's a temporary assignment. I want to go back when you mentioned when we design the change, we need to understand, how the system works. And I've actually come across one example where we were very excited about the change, and I was part of the group that was leading the transformation. I mean, the interesting thing is that we were all contractors, so that even adds another complexity to it, right? because because we are our own system going into a new system.
Right.
What we discovered that within the organization we were fine, but then the organization is part of a government-wide system and nodes. And so we discovered that whilst it was fine to roll it out within that particular organization, their system, they're one system out of a network, and that network does not support the proposition that we are driving within that.
Right.
So, for example, interpreting Privacy Act, we discover that this particular organization sees it in this way,
right,
whereas the other organization, which is under the same government, interprets it differently, and therefore we've got another system that blocks our system from doing that. And then it's like we've got two solutions. We either try to change that organization way of interpreting that, which is a very long-winded process because you need to sign off, you need a lot of things to actually be put legally, or ignore it, knowing that our transformation is not going to be implemented completely.
Right.
Yeah. So that's how I see what you're talking about is that, and it's not an easy task, Joan, is it?
It's not an easy task because I think what you're describing is complexity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I think one of the biggest issues is, whilst it's not easy, we need to do it.
Yes.
We need to step into it, because otherwise that's the blind spot. We think that we can drop simple, complicated technical solutions into the system without actually at times seeing and noticing the complexity that we have to work with. Okay. And then that becomes our blind spot. So stopping to take the time to understand the system and the complexity of the system that we are doing the change with is absolutely vital. But what I don't see happen is that work, right? The stepping back and noticing what are the systemic dynamics? What are all the entities involved here? Who is the client and who is contracting us and bringing us in for what purpose? Because very often there's an explicit purpose, and then there's a kind of secondary systemic purpose, which is we can't convince the other entity to go like our way. So we're going to bring in this group of contractors to be the transformers.
Yes.
And maybe they will kind of be the people who are able to have the role of changing the others.
Yeah.
So you want to be able to see how you as the change agents are getting kind of caught in the system, and how you are part of the system and the complexity of it. If you are able to wear those glasses and step into the discovery of that, that will be hugely liberating, because then you're not caught by the kind of systemic dynamics that are going to get in your way, right?
Yeah.
And as you say, that is not easy work to do. But if we can build a muscle to do that, to discover the complexity, then our chances of getting better returns on investment on our change work is exponential.
Yes, and it's a very worthwhile exercise. I mean, if you're an organization that really would like to, evolve and keep updating their systems, there's no easier way. There's no way out apart from, digging deeper into understanding the system. And I think you mentioned something around, which I'm really interested in, around how we build our mental maps and understanding where we sit in the scheme of we are a node in the network, and we need to understand our. So, do you want to talk a little bit about that mental map, individual mental maps?
Yeah, sure. I think it's based on this idea that every one of us carries a construct or a mental map of the system that we are in. And or the subsystems that we are a part of, and the roles that we play. And if we invite people into, taking out of their heads and drawing down on a piece of paper, how do you see the system? Can you just draw for me a picture of where you see yourself located in the system relative to other roles, relative to other parts or entities? When we ask people to draw that, and I've done this thousands and thousands of times, people will draw that map. And it's like the minute we join a system, we form this mental map. It's like if you are dropped in a new city or dropped, in the jungle, and you don't necessarily yet have a laid down map of how the system works or that ecology works, you will find a way to form in your mind a map of how it works and where you're located in it.
And that's our attempt to create a level of certainty.
Yeah. And a level of understanding of where do I fit in.
Which is not necessarily a true reflection of the reality of where you sit in. Yeah.
No, because that is your map and your understanding based on from where you sit in the system, and based on the conversations you've had so far around where you're located and where you fit in and how the rest of the system works. Now, what's absolutely vital about this is that we don't know we carry these maps. We don't know that we form them, but we wear them almost like a filter. And we then step into our roles in organizations through these maps. But we don't take these maps out of our head and make them object and look at them and examine them and say, well, is this how others see my role? Is this how other people see how the system should function and work? But when you start to do that, if you're able to know that you carry this map, put it out in front of you and look at it as object, and so it's not running you anymore, but you can see it. And you can then test it as a hypothesis rather than this is truth. And how the reality or the system actually works. And you can start to kind of test whether this map sits in coherence with the way other people see it or the other people's maps. Then you will start to make sense of what's going on. And you will be able to understand organizational behavior and culture in a completely different way.
So is it let me just comment on one, is that if we are not congruent with the real map of the organization, then usually frustration occurs, resistance happens, noise, inefficiencies. Okay. So does that mean, Joan, that there is an opportunity for change practitioners like myself at the design stage, and when we try to sort of uncover the impact of a particular change, we need to think more now around how the system map is set up, and the impacted group of people that will be hopefully adopting the change, how we can help them understand their role in that mental map. Is that something that we need to look at?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you're able to look at that, you can actually create flow and coherence into the system quite rapidly. And once you create that, you unleash energy and capacity.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's a completely different understanding of how to release energy and engagement and capacity in a system from one which says, actually, we need extra resource, or from one that says, actually, what we need is to show people the burning platform, get them to understand, the journey, engage them. So it's not an engagement strategy where you give them more and more information about why this is a good idea. It's a systemic strategy which helps people take up their role or reframe their role in relation to what you're trying to achieve through the change in the organization.
Rather than driving the hard the hard exercise of asking people to change their behaviors.
Yes, or themselves, or their values, or who they are.
Yeah,
right?
which is a tough ask.
It's a very tough ask. It's much harder to change that than it is to reframe roles and role relations in a system.
Fantastic. Hi there. Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more podcasts, check us out at theinnergameofchange.com.au. we are in the middle of a digital transformation surge. We are in the middle of COVID-19. I'm mentioning this because at some stage in 20 years' time, people will listen to this podcast and say, what the hell is COVID-19? How do you see the market and organizations from where you sit? How do you see organizations responding to the change and the disruption? And is it sustainable? Because my sense, and from my experience over the last couple of years, is that we're doing a lot of patchwork. And to your point, we are not looking at the system as a whole organism.
Yeah.
But have I just got a couple of bad examples in my experience, or is that necessity right now? Do the patchwork because there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen over the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think what I am noticing, and I'd be curious if you're noticing the same thing, Ali, is, if we think about how we're wired as leaders in organizations, the role that typically leaders feel like they have to play is to have the answer and, to have the solution and to coach other people to discover what their solution is. Like I hear often that's how the role of leader is framed in organizations. And I think that sits in, comfortably if we're working in like technical linear problems where there's kind of known solutions, and the solution at least is discoverable. But I think when we're in this more complex adaptive change where we don't necessarily know the answers, how can anyone, because we haven't been in the context of a pandemic like this before, then we tend to try and put solutions in place as if we were in a more simple or complicated context. And I think that what I'm seeing happen is that people are trying to come at this complexity using traditional means and using technical means like policies. Like I heard one the other day, which is all roles work from home. These kind of binary, simple solutions, or, no one's allowed to email after 6 p.m.
Yes.
So this is what I'm seeing as examples of these like simple binary solutions, one size fits all for the whole system, versus actually we deep into complexity and multiplicity here, right? And there are probably a multivariate of options for what is going to work for individuals given their contextual realities, right? And the contextual realities of where they fit and what their role is in the system. And so we're trying to put unitary binary solutions in many organizations with good intent, rather than actually lean into the complexity and how we actually learn to contract for multiplicity, right? And for the context, the multiplicity of context that we have to address.
Yeah. And we make those statements like not only no emails after 6, which for me, you were right. It's the intention is that we want to give people lots of time to live their life and spend time with their families and all that stuff. And but it is a blanket statement. I also hear a lot about we've got so much change happening, and then to your point, one of the things that I usually do is that it motivates me, that particular statement, to dig deeper and understand the ecosystem and how things are actually interacting with each other. And based on data, then we make decisions rather than, some emotional or emotive statements like there's so much change.
Right.
And from my experience, if you ask me how leaders are responding nowadays, look, there are 3 types that I've noticed. A type that is still continuing with their old way of leading because that's what they know and that's what they're comfortable with. A type that is really adaptive now, and then they're letting go of some of the command and control and understand that through feedback, then we can navigate our way out of this.
Yep.
And they are comfortable to say, I don't have all the answers. And that comes from trust in that leader and based on their history and experience. And I've got another type which they are sitting and letting the other functions make the decisions, like the HR, the people and culture, IT, and they're sitting almost in an inertia stage where it's saying, let's just see how the market is going to do, is going to react. For example, the working from home. Lots of organizations haven't really made a hard and fast fact to say, even when the lockdowns are lifted, can we come to the office or not? And some organizations saying, well, we're going to leave it up to you. You make a decision. And some organizations saying, well, I can't wait. Once things actually go back to normal, the inverted commas normal, I'd like everybody to be back in the office. Yeah. And then some leaders are sitting now waiting and seeing how others are going to deal with this, similar to how leaders are actually dealing now. Politicians and government officials are dealing with the COVID-19 and how we're actually managing that as a disruption.
Yeah. I think what is really, really critical about what you're saying, and I think is really critical for us to help leaders and organizations start to do, is learn how to design for now. And, I think what we see is these kind of big binary swings, which are, okay, now, for future, this is how our organization is going to be. And that we design for these big binary solutions rather than designing for the now, the temporary, and learning to be in the adaptive. So what is going to work for us now? Let us be able to contract in multiple places for what actually is going to work in this context at this time. And then we'll revisit it.
Yeah.
So we are constantly in the adaptation and seeing where we are as a system. How is the context changing? Of what time are we now? And then we can adjust. And that is building agility into our thinking and into our organizational practice. But what I see instead, people think that they have to design big solutions for the whole system that are simple, that are binary, and that are future-oriented. And I think a big shift that we want to help leaders make is how you can design for current, for context, and for now, and then constantly recalibrate for an adjacent possible.
Yes, and so design for now is a great message. The one thing that I want to ask you about, and we are coming close to the end of the podcast, Orgonomics is a framework that looks at the whole system and review the whole system and look for efficiencies based on the relationship between the individual and the system.
I'd say coherence versus efficiency, but yeah.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Fantastic. And so what's the cycle? Does that mean that, is it on constantly we're looking at the system and fine tuning, or is it like when we do it every financial year, or how does that work?
No, I think that, what you want to wire into your organization as ritual and practice is that we are in continual observation of the system and nudging to our growth edge.
Great.
And that we no longer see change as these big kind of structural moves that happen and then rehappen every 18 months, because the change actually is built into the ritual and the practice of how we deliberately adapt as an organization. And when you're in complexity and the kind of VUCA world that we speak about now, those rituals and practices are going to be absolutely essential to wire into the DNA of organizations. And, that becomes the role of leader, to become system leaders, to be able to step back, notice where the system is now at this point in time, and then look for where is the growth edge, how do we reset a role in a system? How do we change the role dynamic between two subsystems or entities? Because a system, if it is alive and well and thriving and living, is never still. right?
Yeah.
You don't make a change and then that's the change. A system is in constant dynamism of interaction.
Yes.
And so you actually can never stand still. And so you always want to be observing, nudging, and moving towards your growth edge. And if you can build that into your ritual, into your DNA, into your practices as an organization, then you'll have agility. Agility won't come from implementing agile methodology.
No.
Agility will come from designing practices and rituals into your current system.
Yes.
And I think one of those practices, which is really important for us, is, when I talk about rewiring, reframing, repatterning, one of the repatternings happens through how boundaries get set in the organization. If we go back to how people are responding to COVID, trying to put firm boundaries in, like no one will, send an email after 6, those are rigid boundaries. And the role of leader is to create enough boundary conditions in the system so the system can thrive and deal with the adaptation, but not to create the boundaries in ways that are so rigid that they actually don't allow for the system to be in flow.
Because creating a rigid boundary will have a flow-on effect on other things as well. Yeah.
And I think the role of leader is to put boundaries in and to allow the system to put the boundaries in and to contract and negotiate for those boundaries, but not to put them in simple and binary ways, which actually make the system rigid and stuck.
Fantastic. System leadership. That can be a book for you, Joan, to write about. Yeah, great. We are coming to the end of the podcast. What would be your message to the change management and practice community? And I'm part of that community. How can we think about systems when we manage change going forward?
I think what the message would be, if we think about the Orgonomics framework of individual role system, and that subsystems have roles as well, if you think about yourself in the individual, as an individual in role of change leader, how do you see your role? What map are you running of your role in the system, and how might you recalibrate your own map for a more complex context? I think also as a field or as a subsystem or as a change, when you go into a change as a change leadership team, like the example you were talking about where you were the contractors coming in, before you begin the work, step back and notice what your role either individually or as a subsystem is in the entity. Why have we been called into the system at this point in time? What is going on in the system now, which we need to understand? And so you step into not only bringing the systems lens to your clients, but you bring the systems lens to self-enroll in system. And you start to see yourselves in the context of the system. And the more you can practice that, the more you will be able to see what's going on in your client systems, not be caught by it, but be able to manage it far more effectively.
Fantastic. And which means we need to understand our mental map within the whole map of the system that we coming into.
Absolutely. And your clients' mental maps, and do they cohere?
Yes, fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed our chat, Joan. I think you've got a fantastic framework, and I encourage all my listeners to reach out. How do people reach out to you?
I have a website with a lot of the podcasts that I've done and articles that I'm writing and talks I've done. So that's a good place for resource. And if they're interested in more, to email me, and I've got other articles to share and stuff. So absolutely keen to spread this work and give people the glasses, as I was given that gift many years ago. So very happy for people to email and reach out as well.
Fantastic. And we're going to put all your information in the podcast. Joan, I really appreciate your time. I'm grateful. I've learned so much. It made me think a lot that, God, I need to go back and do a lot of work myself. And it's been a pleasure I hope to have you at some stage in the future. Until then, stay well and stay safe.
Thanks, you too, Ali. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of the Inner Game of Change podcast. To know more about our guests and this episode, check out the innergameofchange.com.au website. And remember to subscribe. I can't wait to share with you the next episode. Until then, stay well and stay safe.